In 1991, the Watchtower published an article calling it a betrayal of faith for any church to partner with the United Nations. That same year, the organization quietly submitted its own application to become a registered partner of the United Nations. The man who would oversee that partnership for nearly a decade, who would renew it every single year while his own publications called the UN the prophesied beast of Revelation, was Milton Henschel, the last real president of the Watchtower Society, a man so deeply embedded in the machinery of this organization that he helped build it, run it, and then, when the time came, dismantle the very office he held to make sure the men at the top could never be held personally accountable again. Most Jehovah's Witnesses have never heard his name. That is not an accident, because what happened under his presidency explains everything about the governing body you see today. Part 1. The Bureaucrat. Before Milton Henschel became president of the Watchtower Society, he went on national television and called organ transplants a form of cannibalism. That was not a personal opinion. It was official Watchtower policy. For over a decade, Jehovah's Witnesses were forbidden from accepting any organ transplant, kidneys, corneas, anything, because the men in Brooklyn had decided it was equivalent to eating human flesh. People obeyed. People suffered. And then, without warning, the policy was reversed. No apology, no acknowledgement, no mention of the people who had followed the rule and paid for it. The man who had defended the position on camera simply moved on to his next assignment. That tells you everything you need to know about Milton Henschel before he ever sat in the president's chair. He was not a man of conviction. He was a man of function. Whatever the organization needed said, he said. Whatever it needed done, he did. And when the organization changed its mind, he changed with it, without looking back. Ask any active Jehovah's Witness to name the presidents of the Watchtower Society. They will give you Russell, Rutherford, maybe Knorr, or Franz. Almost none will say Henschel, the man who held the office for 8 years and sat on the governing body for over 3 decades. He has been so thoroughly erased from organizational memory that you could spend a lifetime as a witness and never encounter his name. And that erasure is the point. The organization did not want a president people remembered. It wanted a president who managed. Henschel grew up inside the system. His father worked construction for the Watchtower and moved the entire family to Brooklyn so he could renovate headquarters buildings. Milton was baptized as a teenager and never left. What made him powerful was not theology. It was proximity. As a young man, he became personal secretary to Nathan Knorr, first when Knorr ran the printery, then when Knorr became president. For decades, Henschel was the man standing 2 feet behind the most powerful person in the organization. He said very little, but he watched everything. He traveled to over 150 countries. He supervised 1/10 of all Watchtower branch offices worldwide. He knew the money, the logistics, the internal politics, which leaders were loyal, which ones were problems, where the pressure points were. When Franz died at 99, the governing body he left behind was barely functional. Members in their 80s and 90s. Reports of men falling asleep in meetings and being woken up to cast votes. The theological framework crumbling. And Milton Henschel, the invisible bureaucrat who had spent a lifetime learning exactly how the machine worked, stepped into the presidency. Not because he was the most spiritual man in the room, because he was the most useful one. The Watchtower announced it in a single sentence at the bottom of Franz's obituary. No fanfare, no profile, just a name and a title. That should have been the first warning about what kind of presidency this would be. Part 2. The Deal with the Beast. Of everything that happened under Henschel's presidency, nothing exposes the organization's double standard more clearly than what it did with the United Nations. For decades, the Watchtower had taught its followers that the United Nations was the scarlet-colored wild beast described in the book of Revelation. Not a metaphor, not a loose comparison. The UN was, according to official doctrine, a counterfeit of God's kingdom, an institution that all true Christians were obligated to reject completely. Witnesses were told that even having a political affiliation was a betrayal of their faith. Members were disfellowshipped for joining political organizations, for voting, for any act that could be interpreted as supporting the systems of this world. So what did the Watchtower do in the very first year of Henschel's presidency? It became a formally registered non-governmental organization with the United Nations Department of Public Information. Not informally, not through a back channel, through an official application submitted to the UN, reviewed by UN staff, and approved under terms that required the Watchtower to support and respect the principles of the UN Charter and to conduct information programs about United Nations activities. That language comes directly from the UN's own confirmation letter. Now here is the part that matters most. In the very same period that headquarters was filing this application, the organization published a Watchtower article titled, "Their Refuge, a Lie." That article condemned the Catholic Church specifically for forming NGO partnerships with the United Nations. It described those partnerships as seeking false refuge in the political systems of this world. It called it a betrayal of faith. And while millions of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world were studying that article at their weekly meetings, nodding along, underlining the paragraphs, the men in Brooklyn were doing exactly what the article condemned. This was not a one-time mistake. The partnership lasted a full decade. Every single year, the Watchtower renewed its NGO status. Every year, senior Bethel officials, not low-level staffers, but men operating under direct governing body authority, attended UN briefings and conferences. Every year, articles were published in Awake magazine that were carefully written to satisfy UN requirements for public information while stopping just short of openly endorsing the institution. Those articles were recorded in UN archives. Ordinary witnesses had no idea any of it was happening. And how did it end? Not through conscience, not through internal reform. A journalist at the Guardian newspaper broke the story. And the very next day, not the next week, not after internal review, the very next day, the Watchtower filed to terminate its NGO status. That speed tells you they knew exactly what they had been doing. They were not confused about the criteria. They were not unaware of the contradiction. They were simply betting that no one would find out. The official excuse was remarkable. Headquarters claimed the partnership was necessary to access the UN's library. A library card. That was their justification for a decade of formal association with what they had called the prophesied instrument of God's enemies. The United Nations responded with a letter confirming that the criteria for NGO association had not changed at any point during the Watchtower's membership. They had known the terms from the beginning. Thousands of witnesses left the organization when this became public. For many, it was not a doctrinal disagreement or a personal grievance that broke their faith. It was the realization that the men who demanded total loyalty, who expelled members for far lesser acts of political association, had been doing in secret what they punished others for in public. And through all of it, Milton Henschel was president. Part 3. 26 Faces. While the Watchtower was quietly maintaining its partnership with the United Nations, it was publicly sending a very different message to its followers, and it put it right on the cover of a magazine. Awake, May 1994. 26 photographs of young witnesses arranged across the front page. The headline read, "Youths Who Put God First." Inside, the magazine explained what that meant. It stated that in former times, thousands of youths put God first at the cost of their lives, and that they are still doing it. Only today, the issue is medical treatment and blood transfusions. Every young person on that cover had refused a blood transfusion and did not survive. The magazine did not present their stories as cautionary tales. It presented them as examples of faithfulness. These were, in the Watchtower's framing, role models, young people whose loyalty to organizational policy was held up as the highest possible standard, and that magazine was distributed to millions of families around the world, including families with young people the same age as the ones on the cover. It was studied. It was discussed in kingdom halls. It was presented as an example of what true devotion looks like. This happened directly under Henschel's presidency. And it was not an isolated moment. The blood transfusion prohibition had been in place for decades, and by the 1990s, medical researchers were documenting that it contributed to a significant number of preventable losses every single year. One analysis estimated that since the policy was implemented, tens of thousands of witnesses may have been affected as a direct result, a toll that, stretched across decades, is staggering in its scale. And here is where the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. While the Watchtower was publishing these stories, it was saying something very different behind closed doors. During Henschel's presidency, the organization signed an agreement with the government of Bulgaria in which it stated that members should have free choice regarding blood transfusions, without any control or sanction from the organization. That language was part of a deal to gain legal recognition in Bulgaria. The European Commission of Human Rights published a press release confirming the Watchtower's stated position. that there are no religious consequences for a Jehovah's Witness who chooses to accept a blood transfusion. Read that again. No religious consequences. While the organization was telling European courts that the blood policy was a matter of personal conscience, it was telling its own members the exact opposite. Accept a transfusion and you have disassociated yourself. Your family will stop speaking to you. Your community will treat you as though you no longer exist. That was the reality on the ground. The legal position and the lived experience were two completely different things. And the man sitting in the president's chair allowed both versions to exist at the same time. This was the same man who had called organ transplants cannibalism, a position that was also quietly reversed without any acknowledgement of the consequences it created. The pattern never changed. Announce a rule with absolute authority. Enforce it with the threat of total social isolation. Wait until the rule becomes legally or publicly indefensible. Reverse it quietly. Suggest the members took it too far. Move on. The bill came due. You already know the teaching. Armageddon would come before the generation alive in 1914 passed away. You heard it at every meeting. You read it in every magazine. The Awake. Masthead printed it for years as a statement of purpose. What you may not have thought about, because the organization does not want you to, is the price people actually paid for believing it. There is a woman who never went to college because her parents told her the system would not last long enough for a degree to matter. She is in her 60s now. She cleans houses. There is a couple who never had children because bringing a child into this world seemed pointless when Armageddon was just around the corner. They are in their 70s. They are alone. There is a man who turned down a promotion, then another, because dedicating more time to a career felt like a betrayal of his faith. He retired with nothing, no savings, no pension, no plan, because the plan was always paradise. These are not hypothetical people. If you are watching this video, you either know someone like this or you are someone like this. Millions of witnesses made life-altering decisions based on a guarantee that the organization delivered with absolute confidence for decades. Not as a suggestion, not as a possibility, as a certainty backed by divine authority. And then, under Henschel's presidency, the guarantee was withdrawn. A Watchtower study article quietly redefined the word generation, detaching it from the people literally alive in 1914 and stretching it into something so vague it could mean anything. The framework that had driven urgency for decades was removed in a single paragraph and replaced with language designed to mean nothing specific at all. The article called it New Light, Progressive Understanding from Jehovah. But here is what it did not include. It did not include an apology to the people who had sacrificed careers, educations, families, and financial security based on the previous teaching. It did not include any acknowledgement that those sacrifices were made because the organization had spoken with a certainty it had no right to claim. It did not include a fund for elderly witnesses with no retirement because they had been told retirement was irrelevant. It did not include anything at all for the people who had obeyed. Because that is how the pattern works. The men at the top set the expectation, the people at the bottom bear the cost. And when the expectation fails, the men at the top redefine the words, and the people at the bottom are left to figure out how to live with what they lost. Milton Henschel did not personally write that study article, but he led the organization that published it, distributed it to millions, and expected every witness on earth to accept it without a single question, while offering nothing to the ones who had given everything based on what the organization had said before. Dismantling the throne. Everything Henschel did during his presidency was consequential. But his final act was the one that reshaped the organization permanently. In the year 2000, Henschel oversaw a structural reorganization that most witnesses barely noticed at the time, but that fundamentally changed how power works inside the Watchtower. He and every other governing body member stepped down from the boards of directors of all Watchtower legal entities. The presidency, the title held by Russell, Rutherford, Knorr, Franz, and Henschel himself, was handed to a man named Don Adams. A man with no doctrinal authority, a functionary, a signature on legal documents. The governing body retained all spiritual authority, the power to set doctrine, enforce policy, direct the lives of millions, but severed its formal connection to the corporations that carried out those directives. On the surface, the organization framed this as humility. The governing body was stepping away from business matters to focus on spiritual leadership. That was the story. The reality was something else entirely. By separating themselves from the legal entities, Governing body members created a firewall between their decisions and the legal consequences of those decisions. The men who mandated the blood policy, who enforced shunning, who maintained the two-witness rule in abuse cases, those men no longer held any corporate title that tied them directly to the organizations executing those policies. If lawsuits came, and they were already beginning to come, the legal target would be the corporation and its appointed officers, not the governing body members who set the policies in the first place. Think about what that means in practice. The same men could stand on a stage at a convention and tell millions of people how to live, who to associate with, what medical treatment to accept or refuse, and then walk into a courtroom and say they were merely a spiritual advisory body with no corporate responsibility. Direction without liability. Authority without accountability. That was the architecture Henschel helped build before he stepped down. He was the last president who was also a member of the governing body. After him, every president has been a placeholder. The era where one visible leader could be identified as the head of Jehovah's Witnesses was over, replaced by a committee structure that spreads responsibility so broadly that when things go wrong, no single person can be held to account. The governing body today operates exactly this way, visible enough to demand obedience, protected enough to avoid consequences. And that structure is Milton Henschel's most lasting contribution to the organization. Milton Henschel passed away in March 2003. His obituary in the Watchtower was titled, "He Loved Kindness." There was no mention of the United Nations partnership, no mention of the magazine cover, no mention of the generation promise that was abandoned, no mention of the corporate restructuring designed to protect the governing body from legal accountability. Just a quiet tribute to a kind man who served faithfully. That is how the Watchtower handles its history. When a teaching fails, it becomes old light. When a policy causes harm, it becomes a matter of personal conscience. And when a president presides over a decade of institutional contradiction, he becomes a kind man who is barely mentioned again. But the record is there. The Guardian article is there. The UN confirmation letter is there. The magazine cover is there. The Bulgaria agreement is there. The corporate filings are there. None of this is speculation. None of this is opinion. It is the documented history of what was happening at the top of the organization, while ordinary witnesses were being told to trust, obey, and never question. Every former witness who was made to feel wrong for doubting, who lost their community for asking questions, or who was told their independent thinking was a sign of weakness. Look at what the men in charge were doing during those same years. They were not living by the standards they imposed on you. They were managing a corporation. And Milton Henschel, the invisible president, was the one holding it all together.